My name is David Littman, and I'm a senior analyst at CAMRA, the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting and Analysis. As the State of Israel has once again been forced to defend itself, the topic of international law and the law of armed conflict has, like clockwork, become a hot issue. Of course, it only seems to become a prominent issue when Israel defends itself, not when other nations engage in warfare or when Israel's enemies attack it. If I may quote from two experts on the subject of the laws of armed conflict, Professors Jeffrey Korn and Lieutenant General Robert Ashley, weaponizing information by our enemies, both state and non-state, is already a significant line of effort. For many of those enemies, often facing substantial tactical and operational disadvantage, information is not conceived of as a supporting effort to combat. Combat is a supporting effort for or to their information, or more accurately, disinformation campaigns. There are few adversaries who fit this description quite as well as Hamas. Unfortunately, at CAMRA, we are seeing far too many media outlets play into the hands of terrorist organizations like Hamas through inaccurate, lazy, and frankly biased reporting on the topic of international law and alleged violations of it. This issue and the harm it causes is what our guest is here to speak about today. Natasha Hasdorf is a barrister and expert on international law, including the law of armed conflict, foreign affairs, and national security policy. She holds law degrees from Oxford University and Tel Aviv University, and was a fellow in a national security law program at Columbia Law School in New York City. Natasha serves as legal director of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust, an organization we at CAMRA are great fans of for the wonderful work that they do. Our organizations recently co-hosted an event on the topic of bias at the BBC, and UK LFI has been a truly amazing partner in helping us support the students we work with at CAMRA on Campus UK. Natasha is going to be giving some opening remarks, and once we finish the opening remarks, we'll have time for Q&A. So I encourage the audience to post any questions that they might have on the subject in the Q&A section that they can see at the bottom of their Zoom screens. Natasha, it's a real pleasure to have you with us here today. And perhaps you can begin by giving us some opening remarks on the subject of the day about lawfare and misreporting on international law and how that's really causing harm.
Well, David, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm grateful for the invitation and also for all of the efforts of CAMRA in this important field. I'll certainly be talking a lot about lawfare, the abuse of international law in particular against Israel, but the manner in which this is fed into, the misreporting, and the manner in which this has snowballed in the last couple of months is palpable, and the work that CAMRA has been doing to counter that is more important now than it ever was. With that, of course, we have to acknowledge that so much of what we have been experiencing over the last 2 months is unprecedented. Unprecedented in terms of the scale of the challenge that Israel is facing in response to an unprecedented attack on Israeli civilian communities in the south of Israel, and the scale and level of the atrocities that we have been learning about over the last 2 months since the 7th of October is, by many people's estimations, set only, of course, to become more horrific as further details emerge. Against this backdrop of the unprecedented, of course, we have a long history now of Israel being targeted by this phenomenon of lawfare, and the manner in which this is fed into so much of the coverage of the Israeli-Arab conflict more broadly. But I certainly see lawfare as an unhelpful practice, an abuse of law for political purposes. And I'm taken back in particular to an op-ed that I recall reading in the New York Times, already in 2011 by Mahmoud Abbas. Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, now in his 18th year of his 4-year term, wrote already in 2011 about his call to internationalize the conflict as a legal, not just a political matter. He called for Israel to be targeted at the International Court of Justice, at the International Criminal Court, and at the UN Human Rights Council. And I read that article as Mahmoud Abbas's declaration of lawfare against the State of Israel. This was an attempt to harm Israel in the international arena where traditional military tactics against this Jewish state had failed in the ultimate goal, which was to eradicate it. And the development of lawfare initiatives against Israel, which had in fairness begun even before that point, but since that infamous op-ed has gathered apace, and it has been assisted by armies of NGOs that have been established and that are funded significantly in order to generate the material to fuel the lawfare initiatives against Israel. And the manner in which this has been so successful relies on two separate substantial misrepresentations over the facts and over the law. And I hope that in the time available to us today, we'll get into examples of each of those. But the way that we have seen it manifesting in international organizations, in the political arena, at the international diplomatic level, has now also, of course, filtered through into the academy and into the media more broadly. And we hear political terms that have no justifiable basis in legal analysis being deployed against Israel on a frequent basis. But they're deployed for the purpose of evoking a legalistic aura to the criticism that Israel is subject to. And we have seen this in the context of accusations of ethnic cleansing, of occupation, of colonialism, and now, of course, more recently of the term apartheid. And in the context of the last 2 months, as in previous operations in the Gaza Strip against Palestinian terror organizations, we have also seen it being deployed in the context of the law of armed conflict, international humanitarian law. And in media coverage in particular, we see these accusations of war crimes against Israel abounding with no, but I mean no, analysis of what those allegations are contending. Of course, the bizarre, inverted reality here is that on the 7th of October and since, we have seen war crimes, crimes against humanity, and even genocide committed by Palestinian terrorist groups against Israelis and foreign workers, Jews and Arabs who were caught up in those 7th of October atrocities. And those have, although there was undoubtedly an outpouring of support in the first instance in the context of the media coverage, those war crimes have, it seems, been very quickly forgotten and supplanted by false allegations of war crimes against Israel. I expect that we'll come on to discuss in more detail Israel's approach in the context of the armed conflict law, international humanitarian law, and the measures that Israel takes not only to uphold the framework of the law of armed conflict, but in so many respects to go above it. But I'm particularly impacted by the quote, David, that you opened with, which absolutely underlines the tactics here that have been deployed, in this instance by Hamas, in seeking to generate media coverage and thereby international pressure on Israel. And we've seen the impact of this only in the last week in terms of UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions being put forward advocating for a ceasefire before, of course, Israel's legitimate military goals have been met. Israel's been very clear about its objectives from the outset of the war that was forced upon it by Hamas, defeating Hamas, removing its ability to repeat the 7th of October ever again, despite the leadership's claims. This is the Hamas leadership's claims that it intends to commit the 7th of October over and over again. So defeating Hamas and removing that threat and rescuing the hostages. And calls for ceasefire where those objectives have yet to be met simply support Hamas in their initiatives and in their commitment to continuing their efforts to kill as many Jews as possible and take Israel off of the map. And it's extremely important to recognize, and I think very instructive, that the manner in which Hamas have been able to achieve this objective and in a very short order shift international public opinion is a combination, of course, of the coverage that they have generated, but that is critically based upon the tactics that they have deployed and the manner in which lawfare more generally is being conducted against Israel. Perhaps with that initial introduction, David, I certainly welcome your questions and those from our audience.
Well, thank you so much for those opening remarks. I think the first question I have is maybe you could talk us through some of the common issues in the laws of war. What are the kind of questions media outlets really should be asking when a strike or an airstrike occurs against a building or any kind of military target? What should the media be investigating in order to determine whether this was a legitimate strike or not?
Well, the first thing that I think the media is getting wrong is engaging in what seems to be an effects-based analysis. So the international law of armed conflict works on an analysis of intention, not effects. It is plain that we have been seeing for some time now distressing images emerging from Gaza, and those will make any right-thinking, reasonable person distressed about the situation that ordinary Palestinian civilians are facing. What is missing from those images is the context, of course, but critically, any analysis of what it is that has caused the destruction that we are seeing broadcast so frequently. And by that I mean not just that Hamas began this war on the 7th of October, and therefore one would expect to see the international community attributing the blame for what has followed properly at the Hamas atrocities that necessitated Israel's response in defense of its civilian community, but also critically that on a picture-by-picture or story-by-story basis, we simply do not have any information as to what the cause of the destruction has been. We know as a matter of fact that the Hamas missiles and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad missiles, which are fired towards Israeli civilian communities in the south of Israel, frequently fall short in the Gaza Strip. In the context of this operation and in the fog of war, it is very difficult to be specific about what is unfolding, but we have plain evidence and statistics. In the previous conflict with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the estimates were that a third of their missiles, especially at the beginning of the campaign against Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, a third of their missiles that were intended to kill Israeli civilians, in fact, fell short in the Gaza Strip, killing their own Palestinian civilians. Now, that is not something, unfortunately, that the Palestinian terrorists firing these missiles see as a negative. On the contrary, as you indicated, Professor Korn had pointed out, the tactics are unfortunately aimed not just at killing Israeli civilians, but in so many respects also at driving up the number of Palestinian civilian casualties. And so what we are missing from any analysis by the international media, but also, shockingly enough, by NGOs, by UN bodies, and by diplomats and politicians around the world, is any assessment of what the images of the destruction have in fact been caused by. Similarly, of course, when media are talking about Hamas casualty figures, these are coming out of the Hamas-controlled Palestinian Ministry of Health. There is increasingly now, because of serious pressure that has been brought to bear, a trend, it seems, that media outlets will indicate that these are Hamas-controlled ministries that are putting these figures out. But we still do not have a real sense of caution as to the numbers themselves. And there is absolutely no indication, again, of the two key factors that are missing in that information, namely who these people are, whether they are combatants or civilians, because Hamas does not make that distinction in the numbers that they are putting out, and critically how they were killed. And we know that a portion of them will have been killed either from rockets falling short in the Gaza Strip, or we've also seen reports, distressingly, of Hamas shooting fleeing civilians and bombing civilian convoys because they are so desperate to hold on to their human shields. So that is a very important piece of the puzzle that is missing. But when we come to assess any action and conduct, a proper analysis of the law of armed conflict, unfortunately, is also missing from the media coverage. The framework of the law of armed conflict essentially, on a simplified basis, comes down to three key principles. The principle of military necessity, the principle of distinction, and the principle of proportionality. All of those are informed by a sort of overarching principle of precaution. And that requires that law-abiding armies take precautions to prevent civilian casualties. We can talk about some of the ways that Israel has and continues to do this. But the principle of military necessity is critical and is one that is frequently misrepresented, particularly where Israel is accused of indiscriminate bombing or collective punishment. Both of those false allegations entirely sidestep the principle of military necessity, which Israel adheres to, which means that it takes actions that are necessary for it achieving its lawful military objectives. And I set those out a few moments ago. The principle of distinction, the importance of differentiating between military combatants and civilians, those that are not taking part in the hostilities, and critically also between civilian infrastructure and terror infrastructure. Now, the fact that Hamas embeds itself in civilian infrastructure and uses hospitals as command and control centers and fires missiles from schools and keeps weapons caches in clinics. This is occasionally being reported now by the international media. But what they are seemingly still failing to point out is the breach of international law that this means, that this is a war crime. And Hamas, on the contrary, they are not being criticized as they should internationally, in particular by UN bodies, but the consequences of their actions in embedding themselves in hospitals, schools, using ambulances to transfer fighters and munitions, that is having the effect of international calls that this should give Hamas immunity. Now, this is critical because the repercussions, the consequences of the suggestion that terrorists may immunize themselves against lawful targeting by hiding behind civilians has consequences not just for how Israel is able to prosecute this military campaign in defense of its civilians, but undoubtedly such a bizarre and repugnant rewriting of the law of armed conflict will have consequences for law-abiding armies around the world and their abilities to defend their own civilian communities. I mean, we see the juxtaposition of what is being said about Israel's conduct here against, the measures taken by the Allied armies in Operation Enduring Freedom, in fighting terrorism, in the context of the war on terror. And we see an entirely separate standard, a new inverted form of law being deployed, which ultimately, of course, isn't real law. It is lawfare, and it is being deployed to great effect, plainly in terms of the turn of public opinion. The final principle that it's worth addressing here in some detail is that of proportionality. Now, the principle of proportionality is perhaps the most misrepresented element of public international law more generally, let alone the law of armed conflict. And it is so frequently being presented in the media as, a casualty count on both sides and a comparison. I mean, that is also an utterly morally repugnant suggestion. It seems to follow, and Douglas Murray and others have had some sport by calling out how ludicrous the suggestion is that Israel would be required to reciprocate or act in precisely the manner in which the Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations conducted themselves on the 7th of October. Now, it's trite that nobody would expect Israel to behave in that fashion, not least because, critically, Israel does not target civilians. But the additional problem with the way that the principle of proportionality is being misrepresented is that it serves to encourage Hamas in their use of civilians as human shields. It is sending a plain message that so far as the international media coverage and the international community's response is concerned, the more casualties that Hamas is able to manufacture, and that is not to say that civilians have not been killed in Gaza, and I'll come on to aspects of civilian deaths in the law of armed conflict and how perhaps they compare with other armed conflicts. When I say manufacture, it's because we cannot interrogate the validity of the figures, and we simply don't know the circumstances in which these civilians that Hamas allege have been killed. But the numbers that the authorities in Gaza are putting out to the media on the basis of this false presentation of proportionality, well, they're exactly what seems to be generating additional pressure on Israel to stop defending itself. So that is why I say it is encouraging Hamas's use of civilians as human shields. That's what proportionality does not say. What proportionality in the law of armed conflict does require is that the reasonable military commander makes an assessment. And this is applicable on a strike-by-strike basis. And that assessment is to weigh up the anticipated military advantage expected from a strike against the anticipated civilian collateral damage. That is a balancing exercise that is incredibly case-specific. It simply cannot be analysed in the abstract. It cannot be analysed on the basis of no evidence that we have emanating from the Gaza Strip. It is a decision taken on the basis of the information available to the Israeli Defense Forces as I say, on a strike-by-strike basis, and it has to be weighed up against the military objectives here, which on a macro level, of course, are significant and challenging, namely the destruction of Hamas. On a micro level, each individual strike is approved in advance, target lists by groups within the IDF that include lawyers. The Military Advocate General Corps, which importantly sits outside of the chain of command of the Israeli Defense Forces, it is answerable to the Attorney General. That is so that there is no issue when any army lawyer has to tell a more senior officer that a particular strike will not be going ahead because their assessment of the lawfulness of it is on the wrong side of the line. So that is critical. But these decisions that are taken on pre-approved target lists and then, of course, later in real time, have to take into account the intelligence that the IDF has as to the whereabouts of civilians and the likelihood that civilians will be collateral damage in a strike. I said that the law of armed conflict takes into account that civilians will be killed. It is in fact predicated and based on the fact that it is an inevitability that in the horrors of war, civilians are going to die. That's why I was particularly shocked in the first weeks of the war to hear John Kirby, himself a man with military experience from the Navy in the United States, asserting that the appropriate number of civilian casualties in an operation such as this was 0. For a military man to have made that statement is deeply, deeply irresponsible. I note today that he has come out with an alternative version which suggests that he accepts that Israel is taking the sorts of measures to prevent civilian casualties that even the United States, put in similar circumstances, would most likely not be striving to achieve. So that analysis does seem to have changed. But the comment that was made in the early period of the war against Hamas, that there should be no civilian casualties, is extremely irresponsible, and it has fed the layers of misinformation and misreporting, unfortunately, in terms of the facts and the law, as Israel has continued through this war with Hamas. The law of armed conflict is essentially based on the recognition that civilians will perish. And it is the framework was introduced in order to seek to minimize the number of civilians who die as much as possible. And proportionality is a key component in achieving that objective. Now, Israel's assessment of proportionality also informs the other measures that Israel takes to prevent civilians from being caught up in the war. And as I indicated, it's informed by the principle of precaution. And what this translates to, of course, is Israel encouraging civilians to evacuate, providing humanitarian areas. In the last few days, we've seen a substantial number of rockets being fired towards Israel from within these humanitarian areas. So it's plain to see how the terrorists exploit Israel's efforts in this regard. But the measures that Israel has taken also include phone calls to individual householders, text messages, the dropping of leaflets. Our viewers may be familiar with the concept of knock on roof. This was a tactic also developed by Israel in order to provide a final warning to any civilians who may remain within a building despite all of the previous warnings before that building is ultimately struck. And in all of this, Israel has certainly led the way in deploying the principle of precaution, but also critically gone above the requirements of the law of armed conflict, it's important to recognize that LOAC is a basic level that is required of law-abiding armies. But the IDF, and this has been consistent through previous operations that have actually been analysed after the event, the IDF has plainly adhered to a standard that it has developed, the code of arms, code of ethics, that is taught to ordinary soldiers in their first weeks of training. And that is palpable when one looks at the ultimate casualty figures, those that have been verified, and compares them with other statistics. So I have seen that the United Nations has put out a global average. I understand it to be in the context of urban warfare, but a global average of civilian to combatant deaths in the context of armed conflicts around the world at a very disturbing 9 civilians to every 1 combatant. In comparison, the statistics put out by the United States vis-a-vis their operations in Iraq and Afghanistan are between 3 to 1 and 5 to 1. Earlier this year, in an operation that Israel conducted against Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Operation Shield and Arrow, the Jerusalem Post were reporting the analysis of a civilian to combatant ratio of 0.6 to 1. I mean, 0.6 to 1 strikes me as unprecedented. Of course, in the current context, because of the military aims I described, because of the scale, and because of Hamas tactics and the Hamas terror infrastructure, which of course they have had the opportunity to build, embed themselves in extremely deep tunnels ever since they violently seized control of the Gaza Strip in 2007. So this context in this operation is undoubtedly different, but what 0.6 to 1 demonstrates is Israel's approach and Israel's intention. This is what they were able to achieve, unprecedented through the measures that Israel takes. So I hope that gives a bit of a flavour of the framework of the law of armed conflict and some of the steps that Israel is taking to surpass the requirements that it imposes.
I hadn't known those numbers. I knew they were good, but not that good.
They won't be as good in this context, ultimately. But again, we're going to have to wait and see, unfortunately,
Right.
when we actually have it may be that we never have a proper handle on the ultimate number of civilians and combatants, for a number of reasons. It's difficult after the event when the only record has been made essentially by Hamas. But also critically, and I'm sure viewers will have seen further footage of Hamas surrendering earlier today. I believe it was from Shajaiya. They were not wearing uniforms. They were giving up their weapons with jeans and sandals on. And in that context, it is understandably going to be extremely difficult to be able to determine the differentiation between civilians and combatants. Ultimately, Israel has intelligence on those members, certainly of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other organizations, and there are reports where it has seemingly tracked those that participated in the 7th of October massacre and seemingly identified them in those that have been taken, that have surrendered more recently. But ultimately, it's a very, very difficult exercise to get down to the figures, which is also why international law, importantly, isn't an effects-based analysis grounded system. It's based on the intention.
Right. And sort of on that subject, one thing I've noticed in a lot of media articles is that the magnifying glass is placed on Israel in terms of these strikes, in terms of the responsibility for protecting civilians. But as far as I understand, in international law and the law of armed conflict, the responsibility for protecting civilians is not entirely on an attacking force. Defenders have responsibility to help get civilians out of harm's way, to not intentionally embed themselves within civilians. And yet, it seems to me that these obligations are not being reported in the media. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what are these obligations that are under the laws of armed conflict are placed upon Hamas, which of course is not going to abide by them, but yet they are not being these obligations don't seem to be shared with media consumers.
Certainly, and no responsibility, it seems, is placed on Hamas. That they seem to be entirely deprived of agency, although this is, of course, not unfortunately new, and we see this in a broader context vis-a-vis the Palestinian leadership more generally. But the principle of distinction that I mentioned applies just as much to Hamas, of course. The fact of the matter that they not only refuse to abide by it, but also cynically abuse it for their own purposes, really means that there's perhaps not very much to be gained, I suppose, in the minds of the international media from highlighting it, because nothing's going to change. And frequently you hear this this contention that, well, it's right that the pressure should be put on Israel because it's the supposedly law-abiding responsible party here. But you're absolutely right. The principle of distinction would require Hamas to differentiate itself from civilians. It does the opposite. Its fighters invariably refuse to wear uniforms. They blend in or seek to blend into the civilian population. The use of human shields, another war crime. The use of hospitals as a command and control center. So it's important to stress that in the law of armed conflict, even a military hospital has protected status. The medical facilities are given the highest status and protection. And the abuse of that by using Al-Shifa and other hospitals in Gaza as command and control centers, as hubs for the terror tunnel infrastructure to hide munitions and militants. This is a cynical breach, but a grave, well, there is, forgive me, there's a separate definition of grave violation, so I shouldn't perhaps use that term, but a really serious breach of law and a war crime. And of course, that is compounded by its own targeting of civilians, not just on the 7th of October, but since then with a continuous fire, but for that brief humanitarian pause, which is, of course, then subsequently broken by Hamas, a continuous fire otherwise of missiles onto Israeli civilian communities, targeting civilians. That is another war crime. And we're not seeing any international outcry, or I should say sufficient international outcry. These are crimes being committed, of course, against Israeli civilians, but also against Palestinian civilians. And we shouldn't be in that position, but it's possible to say, look, the minimization of crimes against Jews simply on the basis that they're Jews is nothing new. And there are deep underlying problems that perhaps date back all the way to the Middle Ages about how this issue is viewed more broadly. But the notion that crimes by Hamas and the other Palestinian leadership against their own civilians, against Palestinian civilians, would be overlooked so routinely, minimized, and even whitewashed is troubling, is odd. We see in this context that it is perhaps attributable to the fact that Israel can be blamed, or even if it's false, there is a separate target here. But we have seen consistent, broader human rights abuses against ordinary Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip by their own leadership. And I myself have spoken out at the United Nations, at the Human Rights Council, about this, and have been met with silence. So the complicity, not just of the international media, but also the international community, international legal organizations, human rights organizations, whose job it is to point out abuses of human rights, have consistently ignored the real violations of human rights, the real war crimes in this context. And that has undoubtedly fed into the background and the context of the reporting that we have seen over the last 2 months.
Right. So one question I have, and I've seen some in the audience have as well, is you talked a little bit earlier about the crime of genocide that occurred on October 7th in southern Israel. And yet it seems when we hear the word genocide on media coverage, the accusation is being made against Israel. And I was wondering if you could walk us through what the crime of genocide is, and how could we best communicate both to the media and to the general public about why this charge fits Hamas's actions, but not Israel's military campaign against Hamas.
So I've just called up the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which is the relevant 1948, came into force in 1951, because Article 2 provides us with this definition. Genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And the acts that are listed include killing, causing serious bodily or mental harm, imposing measures to prevent births, forcibly transferring children to another group. The key here is these are acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a specific group. And on that basis, the acts that we saw, Hamas, I should stress that on the 7th of October, it wasn't just Hamas that crossed the border, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, Fatah, affiliates essentially of the PLO, the so-called moderates in this equation, and by all accounts, many, many civilians. The atrocities committed by that group had a clear intention to target Jews. They fall squarely within the definition of genocide. And if there were any doubt, the continued declarations of the Hamas leadership of their intention vis-a-vis the 7th of October and their intention to commit the 7th of October again and again, that doubt can be dispelled. So not only are they war crimes, not only are they crimes against humanity, but they plainly are genocide. We have not heard that term deployed. And it's extremely concerning because, of course, under the convention, there is an obligation on states parties to prevent and punish that genocide. And to the contrary, the international community, through the votes that we have seen at the United Nations in favor of Hamas, seeking to keep Hamas in power, to maintain their presence in the Gaza Strip, do the complete opposite of what the international community is obligated to, which is to prevent and punish the genocide that has been committed against the Jews and the intention that has been voiced to continue perpetrating that genocide. That is critical, and it is not being discussed. On the contrary, we've had this absurd allegation, and I tie this into and I think I mentioned it in the context of lawfare, the use of legal terms but for political purposes, so devoid of their legal meaning. We've seen this in the context of ethnic cleansing, of apartheid, of occupation, and also of this allegation of genocide. It is baseless in law and in fact. I mentioned the question of intention when assessing the application of the law of armed conflict as opposed to effects-based analysis, intention-based analysis. But it's also critical here in the context of the crime of genocide. What is the intention that Israel has in striking targets in the Gaza Strip? It is plainly to attack and target Hamas terror infrastructure. That is why it has issued the warnings. That is why it uses precision strikes. And that is why, after the initial phase, Israel has gone in on the ground. You know, we hear so many calls for this operation to be sped up or over more quickly. The counterintuitive and bizarre corollary of that is that if Israel were, in fact, to be bombing indiscriminately, if Israel were not to uphold the highest standards with respect to its conduct of this armed conflict, it is, as a matter of common sense, very possible that this conflict would be of much shorter duration. It is because Israel is conducting surgical strikes, precision strikes. It is because Israel is warning civilians and therefore also the terrorists that it is legitimately seeking to target of where the strikes will be that give Hamas an advantage. And it is because Israel is now going house to house, losing a significant number of soldiers as a result, all in order to prevent additional casualties to civilians, to protect the civilians of Gaza. It is because Israel is doing all of this and incurring these heavy losses that the operation is likely to take longer than some are suggesting. The United States more recently is proposing, although there are, of course, conflicting reports on what their official position may be. And that is absolutely something to highlight, to challenge media outlets over, and to ensure that a better understanding is provided to the international public.
The other big accusation that we have seen against Israel for years, but has taken a new flavor, I guess, has been the one of ethnic cleansing. And this is a topic that I find to be one of the most emblematic of the bigger issue of lawfare and miscoverage of international law. We've seen Israel go to great lengths to encourage Gazans to evacuate from areas that are going to be particularly heavy. There's going to be heavy fighting, and they've created evacuation routes and encouraged them to evacuate south of the Wadi Gaza. And yet, instead of being praised for making efforts to get civilians out of harm's way, Israel has been accused of ethnic cleansing by human rights organizations and media, journalists. And this, to me, it strikes me as an example of a complete disregard for what international law and the laws of armed conflict are actually trying to accomplish, that this is playing into Hamas's playbook of keeping civilians in harm's way, misusing international law, and in a way that's only harming civilians more. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this issue of evacuations and a charge of ethnic cleansing, and how this is really playing out in terms of causing harm in Gaza.
Well, I think you're right, and it's extraordinary, isn't it, that Israel's efforts and initiatives to minimize civilian casualties would then immediately prompt this absurd allegation towards it. I'm curious, are these, so far as you see, that the same so-called human rights organizations and journalists that are also at the same time actively advocating for ethnic cleansing of the West Bank, when they say that, Jews shouldn't live in certain places simply because they are Jews? Might that be another example of heinous double standards. Possibly, that's maybe a rhetorical question, but it's very important again to stress that this allegation relies on both a misrepresentation of the law and of the facts. And there's also a key component that is completely missed in terms of international legal obligations on another party who we've yet to mention, and that is Egypt. Because Egypt is a signatory to the convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. It is a member of the African Union, and it ratified this treaty on the 17th of November 1980. And it's a significant convention because it adopts a much broader definition of refugee than the well-known Refugee Convention. At Article 1.2 of this African Union Convention, it says the term refugee shall also apply to every person who, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing public order in either part or whole of his country of origin or nationality, is compelled to leave his place of habitual residence in order to seek refuge in another place outside his country of origin or nationality. Now that's significant because it widens the definition of refugee over and above, a traditional asylum seeker who's fleeing persecution. And it certainly applies, it would seem, those references to events seriously disturbing public order would apply to Palestinian civilians presenting themselves at the border with Egypt. There isn't a general legal obligation to facilitate the entry of individuals of that description across your border as a sovereign state. But Egypt has exactly that obligation under the convention that it signed itself up to. It's a regional convention. It's not international. But, in terms of the sources of law, treaty law is the most significant. It's law that states sign themselves up to and bind themselves by. There can't be an argument about that. And why there is no international furor about Egypt breaching its legal obligation under that convention by refusing to allow access to those civilians that have fled to the south of Gaza. And when we consider the interests here of those civilians and also of the international community in providing them with humanitarian aid, we all know and have done for some time that all materials going into Gaza are at risk of being diverted by Hamas. But of course, if civilians were permitted across the Rafah crossing to Rafah on the Egyptian side, then that humanitarian aid might in fact be provided to them by the international community without diversion to Hamas. So the complete absence of any analysis, any reporting on what international law actually says and on what the relevant parties' obligations are according to their own signatures is utterly extraordinary. And it must come down to the fact that blaming Egypt doesn't really assist with the agenda of facilitating a narrative where Israel is also, forgive me, always at fault. I can't think of an alternative convincing explanation for that glaring omission.
Nor can I. So we have about 5 minutes left. And I want to ask a couple questions. The first one, I want to ask about your personal experiences with the media. You have been doing some fantastic interviews with a number of media outlets explaining all the issues of international law. And I wanted to get your perspective on what you found to be, maybe what has impressed you about the way some hosts have addressed the issues. What have you found disappointing? what are the issues that you really think they're lacking in when you're talking about these issues with them? And maybe even give us an idea of, did you find one outlet to be particularly good or bad?
Well, I think firstly, in general terms, it's extremely frustrating and disappointing that the overall impression I've had is that the main broadcast media is extremely reluctant to have any analysis of real international law, which messes with the narrative that they are consistently deploying and portraying. And that is extremely concerning, not just vis-a-vis Israel, but as I indicated, in terms of lawfare early on in our discussion, I think extremely concerning for the possible repercussions for countries other than Israel later down the line. But I can give a particular example which I found extremely troubling. It's one that relates to an incident I know the audience will remember extremely well. In the first few weeks of Israel's response against Hamas, there was an evening in which the Al-Ahli hospital in the Gaza Strip was reported as being bombed. We now subsequently know this was in fact an explosion in the hospital car park. We still don't know how many people are said to have been injured or killed as a result of that explosion. Some media outlets, and indeed I think some US Congress people, are maintaining earlier tweets that put the figure at a very incredible 500, which was being reported. But on this evening, the reports of this strike had initially come in, and the BBC and others were reporting this as an Israeli airstrike. I mentioned the BBC because I was due to do an interview that evening at 7 o'clock, and I was on the line waiting to go on. And I had not mentioned this, David, I have to say, for some time, but was prompted more recently to write about this for the Telegraph in London when there was an assessment of the complaints that have been made of the BBC's coverage that essentially were not upheld. And I thought that my experience on this occasion would merit being told. Finding myself on the line waiting to go on, I received a call from the deputy editor of the channel, who was very apologetic and said I would have to be bumped for the continuing coverage, the rolling coverage that they had of this strike on the hospital. And I was surprised and frustrated because I had been watching this coverage. And it had been coverage presenting this as an Israeli airstrike. And I said, I am looking, and I was, at reports online that this explosion had occurred in the context of a barrage of rockets fired out of Gaza towards Israel. And I was told, and I insisted that now more than ever, analysis from someone like me was important because there was no evidence as yet that this was an Israeli airstrike. I was told that it had been confirmed from multiple sources that Israel was responsible, and that what I was seeing, the rocket barrage from Gaza, wasn't visible on any of the wires. Well, Hamas, as we know, are not a credible source. I communicated that. And I also said that in the context of the arena in which media was operating at that juncture, this was an hour and a half, I think, before Israel had confirmed it wasn't responsible. There were things, there were knowns and there were unknowns. While it was unknown who or what had struck that hospital, it is known that Israel does not target civilian or protected buildings. It is known that Hamas does. It is known that Hamas keeps weapons caches in schools and hospitals. It is known that Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad missiles fired towards Israel frequently fall short in the Gaza Strip. And on that evening, we also knew that the BBC's coverage of an explosion on the civilian convoy 2 days prior that had been blamed likewise on Israel was proven to be Hamas. And in fact, Jake Sullivan that morning had come out to confirm that that was the case. And despite all of this reasoning, evidence, analysis, that conversation was cut short and they refused to amend their coverage. And the consequences of what we saw being broadcast that evening, the Arab world rising up, deaths occurring in Jenin as riots ensued, and the unfathomable increase in anti-Semitic attacks that we have seen around the world. Several weeks ago, official figures here in the United Kingdom put the increase at over 1,000%. It is not difficult to see how irresponsible, false media coverage, such as that I've just described, contributes exponentially to the very real impact that is felt, not just in terms of Israel and its ability to defend itself, but also, importantly, with respect to the safety of the Jewish communities in the diaspora around the world.
Well, I think that's an incredible anecdote to end our conversation on, that really sums up many of the issues that we are facing in trying to combat media disinformation, and the challenges we're facing in trying to get the real story out there. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time with us today, Natasha. Your explanations have been phenomenal.